Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today we have Michael Jones with us, as well as some of the other members from the Youth Apologetics Empire. So we're just kind of here to kind of discuss Michael's debate with Jim Myers and kind of go over some other criticisms that we found. You can kind of mention it, Michael, later, but yeah, so we'll kind of talk about the debate, and then we're also going to go over just some additional issues that have been going on, because there have been some criticisms of Michael Jones's arguments. So yeah, so take it away, guys.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to kind of point out how this debate came about. Marlon wanted me on his channel again. He mentioned Jim Majors. I said sure. We were trying to figure out topic ideas, and I just mentioned a couple of things I was currently studying, and I mentioned I was studying the arguments for and against the burial, and Jim jumped on that and said he wanted to debate it. And at first I was like, this is kind of like a weird niche topic. But then I was like, this might be the perfect way to show the utter special pleading that skeptics apply to the New Testament or the Bible in general, but they won't apply to other areas of history. Like this, we're not talking about a miraculous claim. We're not talking about something that is a contradiction. Like at least all our sources agree Jesus was buried in a tomb in that general sense. And that's why my first question to Jim was worded the way it does. It's like, why do you accept Jesus was crucified for insurrection? And he basically said flat out it was because of the multiple attestation of the Gospels. But when it comes to the burial of Jesus, he can't accept it on that. So I thought this was a good topic to show that if you start using a lot of these arguments skeptics applied to the Bible and you apply it elsewhere, you can show special pleading quite easily. Now, I will say one more thing, is that unfortunately the day before the debate, Jim lost his slides because his computer crashed. I messaged him and asked if he wanted to reschedule. He said no. And so we went ahead. So unfortunately, he wasn't as prepared as he could have been. But nonetheless, I still thought the debate, I got across what I wanted to in the debate. And we'll deal with the criticisms that came later on, because there's a lot of things I could say about that.
Right. I think I liked how you kind of compared it, because I like how you asked him, why do you believe in the crucifixion? And he said, well, because it's multi-attestated, it's consistent throughout the Gospels. Well, the burial is also consistent throughout the Gospels. So, I mean, why not accept the burial, right? Especially the fact that it's not a miracle event in any sort of way. So
well, what I specifically worded to him was, why do you accept Jesus was crucified for insurrection? I went back and double checked to make sure, because there are no secular sources, Tacitus, Josephus, that mention why Jesus was crucified. They just say, Josephus just says he was put to the cross. So the only way, this is a big argument for skeptics. They think Jesus was crucified for insurrection, and that's why he couldn't be buried in the tomb. But the only reason they know Jesus was crucified for insurrection is because the Gospels tell them. And just like the burial account, there are differences in the way it's reported. Like the trial of Jesus is reported slightly differently in John than it is in Mark. So is the burial account. There's just slight differences. Now, I think they can be easily harmonized, but you can't tell me that you reject the burial because, well, it's got differences in how the accounts are reported. You accept things like the baptism of Jesus or the trial of Jesus was tried for insurrection, even though the Gospels have variations in reporting how that event actually happened. So it's just special pleading. And I also brought up, I went through Livy and Polybius and made notes, and there were so many differences between them, and no one denies that Hannibal crossed the Alps, even though we're not sure about some of the details here and there along the way.
Right. I also find it interesting how he said that the empty tomb narratives are mythological without actually providing any sort of argument for that. I feel like he should have at least provided some sort of argument for why, because I mean there are arguments for why that's the case, but he didn't really do that. He kind of just assumed that it was mythological without providing any justification for that claim.
And we can get more into that later when we deal with Cam and Camille's criticisms. But
yeah,
we can hear what the other people here want.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I guess I just have one quick question regarding the topic of the debate. So it seems to me that there could be two different theses that the pro-burial person could defend here. The first being that Jesus was buried and then being the one that you defended that Jesus was buried in the tomb. It seems to me that if we didn't have the testimony to Joseph of Arimathea, we would still say that Jesus would have been probably buried, as Jody Magnus says in her work on the topic, that Jesus probably would have been buried in some sort of other marked grave, even if Joseph hadn't provided the tomb. So even if one gives arguments against the gospel narratives, one could still defend the thesis that Jesus was buried. Now, in this particular debate, Michael was defending the idea that Jesus was buried in a tomb, but I'm just saying that there could have also been a weaker case that could have been made that Jesus was buried in an actual marked grave that would have constituted proper burial. Not like a trench grave, but an actual marked grave in the ground as well. That's what Jody Magnus says would have happened if it wouldn't have been Passover time and Joseph wasn't sort of a secret disciple of Jesus. And the other thing I wanted to note was that I sort of expected Jim to go in the direction, not just attacking the gospel accounts, but to go the direction that Ehrman and a couple others go, where he's attacking that prior probability of the burial, where he talks about how the Romans wouldn't have granted this sort of thing. And I expected him to make more of a point of that, but that really didn't come up for the most part. I mean, he brought it up a little bit, but I sort of expected him to go after that prior probability. But I think it was actually a good move on his part that he didn't do that, because the most he could show, if he said that the prior probability of Jesus being buried is low, would just be that we would need a little bit better evidence, like better testimonial evidence than to overcome that little improbability. Because even if Ehrman's thesis is low, Ehrman's thesis is true that crucified victims were rarely given proper burial, we would only need a little bit of testimonial evidence to overcome that initial improbability.
Right. And I mean, I would agree if we didn't have accounts about what happened. We would likely just say that, yeah, Jesus was buried in like a common grave, like the Mishnah law talks about. The reason why I think it's likely Jesus was buried in a tomb is because we have attestation for it. For example, I don't think it's likely that people would bring elephants across the Alps. Okay, when the Cimbrians attacked Italy, they didn't bring elephants. When the Visigoths sacked Rome, they didn't bring elephants. Well, I guess we should just dismiss Hannibal because, it's just so unlikely and no one else ever did it. No, we have attestation. It makes us go, yeah, it's likely. Likewise, just because I would say not most crucified victims were not buried in tombs, I think it's likely that Jesus was because we have attestation for it. It's multiple attestation.
It's also interesting that Jim really didn't defend any sort of counter thesis to the idea that Jesus was buried in a tomb, because he agrees that Jesus was crucified. I mean, I have in like big letters on my notes. Then what happened? Like, he didn't defend really any sort of counter thesis as I was expecting him to defend the idea that Jesus' like body was left off to be eaten by dogs, or the idea that it was thrown in just a trench. Like, he didn't defend any of that in the debate.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure where he was going to go with it. I mean, and I will iterate this a lot because I do feel bad that he lost his notes. He definitely that definitely shook him up a little bit, unfortunately. So I think I went over his debate with Jonathan McLatchy, so I know he had other arguments he could have used, and I was prepared for that, but he just didn't. I just felt like he just was thrown off entirely. Kyle too.
Yeah, that's a different. Well, we have the same name, so we just he called himself Kyle too. So
we get it.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to Kyle too, so I think he froze or whatever.
Oh, yeah, he looks frozen to me.
Okay.
I'll send him a quick message just to see if he's still there.
While we're waiting, is there anything else you wanted to talk about in the debate? Because I think for the most
I'm really surprised.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think
it gets weird in the group chat. Say Kyle. So I have a cool.
Oh, wait a second.
Am I there?
Yeah, you broke up.
Okay. Yeah, you're good now.
Yeah.
Okay. He broke.
He's gone.
Yeah,
Kyle, is there anything else you wanted to cover with regards to the debate? TJ, anything?
Maybe just by the fact that I think he mentioned eyewitnesses, but I mean that's pretty much irrelevant to whether or not Jesus was buried. So even if we were to say that the Gospels were anonymous in that sort of way, that's pretty much irrelevant, I would say, to the discussion. But
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to. Go ahead, TJ. Sorry, I was talking too much.
Okay, two other quick points I wanted to bring up just with regards to the debate is one thing I was really surprised that so much was put on this idea that we need to have the tomb of Jesus, and then even with all that focus, I feel like his arguments against the Holy Sepulchre site were actually pretty weak. A lot of scholars do believe that is the tomb of Jesus. So I'm surprised his arguments against that were not any stronger than, oh, well, it sort of seems like a legend to me. And then the other thing is that something that occurred to me is that all of the evidence for the empty tomb is also evidence for the burial. So if someone wanted to go that route and give evidence for the empty tomb, they're also giving evidence for the burial.
Yeah. And even if it isn't the site of the early tomb, as I noted, given the history of Jerusalem, I don't think we can blame them that they may have lost the location of the tomb. The Jews weren't even allowed in Jerusalem anymore, except for like one day of the year. Cut them a break. I mean, it's like of course they're going to lose a lot of locations of holy sites and artifacts and whatnot because it's like
it's always funny how he kind of threw that under the rug as well. Like he just kind of dismissed like the traditional, what at least a lot of Christians think that the original tomb was. He just kind of rubbed it under, but didn't really provide an argument for why that wouldn't be the case. But I mean, so
right. But do you guys want to?
It's overwhelming, but it's decent at least.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I would say. It's very decent. And my opening statement was more about the background knowledge because proponents that follow Ehrman's thesis really try to emphasize the background knowledge is so low that it's very unlikely that Jesus was buried. And my whole thing was like, but look at this background knowledge. And so that's why my opening statement was worded to respond to mostly Ehrman's arguments because I thought that was the route he was going to go. That's why I brought up Quintilian and the Digesta and I even noted it was secondary evidence, but I said, look, even outside of Judea, you could find instances where you could allow a burial. So the background knowledge was not so pessimistic as Ehrman and his followers like to say that it was.
Yeah, even Ehrman's own arguments, like some of the quotations he'll use, like he uses one of them from Josephus talking about how during wartime the crucified victims were not buried. That sort of argument presupposes that during peace, that the idea that they were not buried during wartime is a difference from what was going on during peacetime. So even some of Ehrman's own quotes sort of incidentally confirm the idea that during peacetime something different was going on.
Real quick, I will note I made a mistake in my opening slides. So in one of my opening slides, I mentioned Acts 2 mentions the tomb of Jesus. I know what I did wrong. I meant to write Acts 13, but it's the tomb of David is mentioned in Acts 2:29. The tomb of Jesus is mentioned in Acts 13:29. So I just got mixed up and I wrote the wrong thing down. And I was thinking Acts 2 in my head, even though I knew it was Acts 13. So that was a mistake on my part. The early sermons, one of the early sermons in Acts does mention the tomb of Jesus, even though I wrote the wrong one down.
Okay.
So, Michael, do you think that the stuff in Acts and 1 Corinthians 15, if one is just sort of not willing to grant the Gospels any strong degree of reliability, even on the account of the burial, do you think that the stuff in Acts and the early stuff in 1 Corinthians 15, in addition to the stuff outside of the biblical literature, do you think that's enough to say Jesus was probably in a tomb, or would you go the route of saying, okay, Jesus had a known burial place, and then the gospel accounts fill in that it was a tomb?
I mean, if we're going to grant Acts 13, then we have to grant there is some sort of tomb. We couldn't say it was like a rich man's tomb. Maybe it was like, some sort of really like cheaply made kind of tomb. I can't even think about what that would be, though. But I think Acts 13 is enough to suggest the Sanhedrin buried him in a tomb. That shows it right there. And again, I would think combined with Mark's gospel should be enough to show that Jesus was buried in a tomb. Just like I think Polybius, writing 50 years after the Punic War, is a reliable account of the Punic War. Like Hannibal really did bring elephants across the Alps, even though that's incredibly improbable. It just didn't happen. It only happened once, as far as we know. So this idea that something, just because something's improbable, it's unlikely it didn't happen, is absurd. As I said, and I've been emphasizing this a lot, is that skeptics apply a special criteria to the Bible they wouldn't apply to like Polybius or to Josephus or to Plutarch. It's absurd.
Right.
Do you guys want to move on to like the later criticisms after? Because I found a lot of funny things with that.
Yeah, sure. We can. I'm trying to get the others to. I guess Dylan's coming back. He's going to be here in 2 minutes, but I guess we can start. Addressing the other stuff.
Yeah. So on another channel, the Camille and Cam Spears did like a 2-hour like breakdown of my opening statement, and I was chuckling a lot through it because I kept finding examples of special pleading, or what seemed to be special pleading, if I'm going to be as fair as I possibly can, throughout their entire talk. One of the things, or two things I want to note off the bat, is that they kept getting upset that in my limited 10-minute opening statement, I didn't go into like the nuances of Philo, or I didn't go into the nuances of the Passion narrative. I had 10 minutes. I'm not going to cover everything. I look forward to their breakdowns of Bart Ehrman's opening statements and some of his debates, and note why he doesn't go over the complicated debate between the conservative and liberal scholars on some of the contradictions he brings up. So I thought that was incredibly just unfair of them to even say. I was prepared to go more into Philo. In fact, I'm doing a whole video on Pilate at the end of the month. I'm going to go into a lot of what Philo says. So I thought that was unfair. The second thing is they got upset when they got to one of my ending slides where I put up on the left-hand side the arguments that Ehrman initially uses to show that Jesus was not buried in a tomb or it was unlikely. And then I listed all my arguments, and they didn't like that. And they said, they mentioned that I was leaving out several arguments. Ironically, going through their entire 2-hour thing, they didn't really add many additional arguments to suggest Jesus was not buried in a tomb. The only ones I can get is they just think it was just so astronomically improbable. They make a conjecture based on the character of Pilate and how he's portrayed in Philo, mostly Philo, because Josephus is much more nuanced, and they didn't cover that. And then they try to argue that there's a lot of literary devices from the Old Testament in Mark, so it's like it's all mythology. With regards to the first argument in terms of probability, that's not a good argument. Because, again, think of all the improbable things that happen that we accept in history because we have attestation for it. A very good example is Titus' sack of Jerusalem. He crucified, hundreds, thousands of Jews? Well, Josephus tells us at one point he asked Titus to take down 3 of his friends. Are we going to say, well, that probably didn't happen because it was just so improbable? Well, it was improbable. It didn't happen for most of the people that were crucified. But we think it's likely that those 3 friends were brought down because we have attestation for it. But again, you can't use that when it comes to the Gospels, because the Gospels are always questionable until proven innocent. So you can use those type of improbability arguments against them, even though we have attestation in Acts 13, the early sermon there, and in Mark's Passion narrative, John, and even Matthew and Luke as well, but they won't accept that.
Yeah.
But, but that's just...
I didn't watch the response to your stuff. I watched some of it, but not all of it. But I mean, that argument, I would agree that it's not that great because it's mostly just based on either subjective opinion, or you could make an argument against, like, let's say the moon landings, right? I always like to use that example, basically, that it's less likely that the moon landings occurred because, who's ever been to the moon, right? Almost never. But again, we have to look at the evidence, right? It doesn't matter.
I can't iterate this enough, but skeptics apply a special standard or special principles to the Gospels or to the Bible in general. They don't apply to any other area of history. And either they're not reading that much on history, or they're not recognizing this double standard going on. For example, I've been watching a lot of videos on the Imjin War in Korea, happened at the end of the 1600s. At one point, the one Korean admiral, Yi Shun-shin, manages to defeat an armada of Japanese ship that's over 300 ships. He defeats them with only 12 ships. Doesn't lose one ship, but it manages to sink 30 some of the Japanese ships. Okay, that's improbable. If 12 ships are going up against 300 ships, it's very likely that 12 ships are going to lose. But we think Yi Shun-shin actually did win this battle because we have attestation for it. Just because something is improbable, that doesn't mean you get to just push away all of the attestation. Again, skeptics apply a standard they will not apply to any other area of history. They're not just going to dismiss attestation just because they presuppose something's improbable, or because something can be improbable or is improbable. We tend to think improbable things happen if we have attestation for it, and there's nothing like miraculous about it, for example. I mean, that's another topic altogether, but you get my idea.
All right. Hey, yeah, sorry. Sorry, I was late. Oh, sorry. Were you talking?
I was just going to say one thing. It just seems to me also so obvious that like something like the 12 against 300 is much more initially improbable than the idea that Jesus would be buried in a tomb, because at least we have some other examples of the Romans doing something like this, or the Romans allowing this sort of thing, and then the Jewish precedent for it. How low can you get that initial improbability, right? Like, what are you going to say? Oh, it's less than 50% likely? Like, okay, fine. But a little bit of testimonial evidence is going to really make that initial improbability like nothing. It's just going to eviscerate that so quickly. So if you're going to really make the argument that it was initially improbable that Jesus would be buried based on Pilate and all this stuff, you have to be defending an idea that it was very improbable. And I don't think that burden has been met at all.
Yeah, I think you can use improbability arguments if you don't have attestation for something. Like, we don't have attestation on how Tut died. So some people might posit maybe a Hittite assassinated him. Well, that's improbable. But if we had attestation for it from like Hittite annals, we might say, well, it's more probable because we have attestation for it. But go on, Dylan. Sorry, we're delaying your.
Yeah, sorry. I was doing an escape room with my friends. I didn't think it would last as long as it did, but I'm here now. So yeah. But yeah, do you want me to introduce myself real quick, or do you just guys want to keep? Okay, yeah. So yeah, my name's Dylan Johnson. I run Rationale Radio on YouTube. I'm currently working on the well, actually, have a few things coming up here pretty shortly, but got something with Josh Rasmussen on the 13th. But other than that, just chilling.
So what was your, just quickly, and we'll kind of move on to what IP was saying. What was your thoughts on the debate?
Yeah, so I thought it was really kind of tedious to watch Jim Majors and his reasoning, because, I mean, obviously the idea that Jesus was buried in a tomb is not an extraordinary claim, and yet he's, trying to deny it, which is kind of silly to me, because, I mean, we have plenty of evidence, external evidence, that Jesus would have been buried in a grave. Now, obviously, we don't have multiple attestation that Jesus, well, we do from the Gospels, but we don't have anything outside that says specifically Jesus was buried in a tomb. But, I mean, the Romans would have allowed this practice anyway, so, I mean, there's no reason to deny it. And, but yeah, IP did good in that debate.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Welcome.
And then Kyle, I know you broke out, so you want to say anything?
Yeah, my internet just died. So yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. The first thing is, and I see this regularly with mythicists in particular, and Jim is not a mythicist in the purest sense, but he's definitely hyper skeptical about a lot of things. But just this idea that regularly I see mythicists giving us reasons to be skeptical of the evidence that we have, rather than this evidence or proof of why that evidence is not good. And so they'll say, oh, this is why you should not trust this evidence, but that doesn't mean that therefore their conclusion is true. And so I don't know if that makes any sense, but I noticed that a lot. No. And then this other thing was this soft scientism, where he just wants the physical evidence of the tomb. And I think you made a good point that even if we had a tomb, he wouldn't trust the location or anything. Because I think the Holy Sepulchre is a pretty good tomb. I think that's there's some good evidence behind that. But even so, it's just this idea of like, oh, we need something physical that we can see and touch and whatever. And I'm like, it's just not how history works most of the time. So.
Right. Well, it's like the tomb with Abraham, and IP brought that up to him, and I know Jim denied it, and that's kind of where I left. And he was like, okay, great, then but I mean, we have supposed tomb of the patriarchs, so even if they could prove that this was the burial place of Abraham and the patriarchs, I don't see any reason why Jim would even accept it. I mean,
yeah, it's interesting. I was actually expecting more objections on Pilate. I was because that's an argument he's used before. That's big for Bart Ehrman. Is that they say Pilate would never allow a burial because he just hated the Jews. It's funny to me because a lot of skeptics they paint Pilate like some sort of one-dimensional Disney villain, like he's just evil. He's just like if he always wants to kill. If Pilate is given a choice in history, he'll always choose the evil one. Like he's got no nuance, he's got no dimensions. He's just this basically a version of like the Huns from the Disney movie Mulan. He's just always evil. He's got fangs for teeth and everything. That seems to be the way they paint Pilate. And that's not how people are in history. They're never that simple. And in fact, when you read the accounts in Philo and Josephus, you get a lot more nuanced. And so like there's a lot you can really go over there. And I'm more than happy if you guys want to go into that to talk about that, because that was another big argument that Cam and Camille tried to bring out. And I think they brushed over a lot of things.
Just a preliminary point on Pilate. I really recommend Helen Bond's sort of biography of Pilate. I read that maybe 6 months ago, and I thought it was really, really good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll check it out. But like they try to say that like the Pilate was just this evil person. They're making a conjecture, basically. They're speculating based on what Pilate would have done, because nothing in Josephus, nothing in Philo talks about what he would have allowed with regards to burial practices. If you look at him in Josephus mentions 3 accounts of a 10-year reign. Okay, if there's only 3 things happening in 10 years, that's not that bad. I mean, look at how much worse Herod the Great was in comparison. It's astronomically different. But I would argue that what we see in Josephus is actually quite consistent with the Pilate we find in the Gospels. And you know, one of the funny things is that not Jim, but Cam and Camille said that I didn't go into the nuances of like the Passion narrative or Philo in my 10-minute opening statement, because I should have really spent the time on that. But they had like 2 hours and they didn't go into a lot of these nuances with Josephus. In fact, they sort of brushed it over, which is kind of ironic to me for them calling me on that. But then they're clearly doing it and they had unlimited time. So the 3 incidents in Pilate, I'll mention the 3 incidents in Josephus, and then you guys can comment on them. But the first one is that Pilate put images of Caesar on the temple, and the Jews protested for several days. Pilate surrounded them with soldiers, right, and said he's going to kill them if they don't leave. The Jews bore their necks to him and said they'd rather die than forsake their law. And then Josephus says, and I quote, "Upon which Pilate was deeply affected with their firm resolution to keep their laws. So he removed the images and didn't kill anyone." Gee, what a tyrant. What a horrible guy. He caves to the Jews. He backs down, doesn't want to kill anyone. That's not this horrible tyrant that wants to end all Jewish law. Yeah, Josephus does say that was his initial goals, but they clearly changed after this first incident. The second incident is with regarding the aqueduct. Pilate uses temple funds to start building an aqueduct. Jews protest. So he puts a bunch of soldiers in the crowd, and when he gives a signal, they're supposed to create chaos and get rid of the crowds. And several people died from this. However, Josephus adds nuance again. He says that the only reason people died is the soldiers, when they were given the signal, they inflicted much greater blows than Pilate had commanded them, punishing those that were rioting and those that were not. Okay, that implies that the only reason people died is because the soldiers went off script. They didn't follow orders exactly. So again, it doesn't look like Pilate wanted to kill anyone there. Some horrible tyrant he is. So again, you see Pilate caving to the Jewish demands, not wanting to kill anyone, pretty consistent with what we see in the Gospels. The third incident is what they bring up always. Oh, this is where Pilate commits a massacre. Not really. Samaritans are going on Mount Gerizim because they're looking for sacred artifacts. Josephus mentions they came out with arms, so they had weapons. Pilate dispatches the Roman soldiers to disperse them. They block the road. And then Josephus says a battle was fought with them. Okay, this isn't a massacre if Rome is fighting a literal battle with people. I mean, this is warfare at this point. Does Pilate massacre after he wins? No, he only puts to death the principal leaders among them. Conservative, 12, if we're being very liberal in our estimates, 50. I don't know, maybe 100. That seems like a lot of leaders for this small little group that, was trying to start some sort of rebellion. Now, I'm not saying Pilate was a good person for doing this, but he's clearly no Herod the Great or Herod Archelaus. Now, they always say, well, this is why, it was so bad that he got sent back to Rome for this. He lost his governorship. Again, no, that's not what Josephus says. It's a little bit more nuanced. They didn't mention this in the reply. Josephus says that the Samaritans sent an embassy to the governor of Syria, saying that Pilate committed murder. And then the governor says, tells Pilate, you have to go back to Rome to answer for this. You have to give your side of the story. So it doesn't say he lost his governorship. It says that, he was accused of something. He's got to go on trial and answer for it. However, Tiberius died before there was ever a trial, so it never actually happened. Given that Pilate had already reigned for 10 years, there's no reason for him to return to Judea at this point. I mean, he had a very long reign as it was. Why, return at that point? So he was never actually condemned. He was never found guilty. He was never removed from his position because he committed some sort of massacre. Again, Josephus tells us the Romans had to fight a battle against the Samaritans here. So there's a lot more nuance here, and you can see correlations to how Pilate is portrayed in the Gospels. Doesn't want to kill people in certain instances. It caves to the Jews upon pressure. I mean, so I don't see where they're getting this horrible tyrant from. I mean, when you read Bart Ehrman and how Jesus became God, he really brushes over a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think the first example you mentioned in particular, I think that's a perfect shining example of how Pilate is almost exactly like he is in the New Testament, where he totally caves to people about crucifying Christ. And so I think that's a clear showing that his character is exactly the same. So,
yeah, one of Pilate's real just defining characteristics is his cowardice, really. And this is both consistent with what goes on in Josephus and the New Testament. And when we look at the gospel accounts, the question arises when Joseph goes to ask for the body, like, why is Pilate giving the body away so easily and all this stuff? And it's easily explained by the fact that it was Passover time, right? Like, there's millions of Jews that are there. He didn't want trouble because if he's already in hot water, essentially, with like certain communities, and they're all the Jews are there during Passover time, like, then it makes perfect sense why he would just acquiesce to the demands of the Sanhedrin leader, because if he figures like the Sanhedrin is going to have some sway over the crowd, and does he really want to riot at Passover time for this sort of thing? And the fact is that the accounts of the burial in the Gospels nowhere hint at this idea that the Passover is the reason that Pilate easily gives away the body. So that like is an incidental confirmation within the Gospels themselves that this seems like something that Pilate would do.
Yeah, the real issues with Philo, though, you'll see them going to Philo a lot more, and there's a lot we could also say on what Philo says with regards to Pilate, and there are correlations to what Philo says with what the Pilate we see in the Gospels, even, I would say. So do you want me to go over that and we can comment on it? So now this seems to be a different incident than what Josephus tells us. It says he put like Roman shields on Herod's palace. So the Jews went and protested. They said, take them down. He didn't do it. So they wrote a letter to Emperor Tiberius. Emperor Tiberius scolds Pilate and has them remove the images right off, just like that. Okay, three things I want to say about this. First, that sets a precedent right there that now Jews have leverage over Pilate. If he gets out of line again, they can just write to Tiberius. He'll get scolded again. Do you really think Pilate wants to be scolded by the emperor twice? No, I think Pilate was a hothead who came into Judea, thought he was going to put up Roman shields or images of Caesar everywhere. Learned his lesson very quickly. That's not going to happen. He got scolded by the emperor. Time to back down. So he gives in to the Jews on this one. What they will know is the language that Philo says about him. It says like that, he was like this murderer. He committed, like he was committing all sorts of these horrible acts where he was putting to death people untried. He was insulting people. There's cruelty. He was murdering people untried and uncondemned. He was, filled with corruption. So the scholar Brian McGinn wrote an interesting paper on this and notes that Philo seems to be exaggerating the language here to sort of paint Pilate in a bad way, to sort of like make a contrast, because he's trying to write to Emperor Caligula at this time and say, don't put this image of Zeus in the temple. And so he comes up with this shining example about this evil guy called Pilate and this shining emperor you should be like Tiberius. So McGinn knows he's probably exaggerating things here a little bit to make this sort of contrast on purpose. And McGinn then even goes on to note that if you go through the whole letter, Philo is using stock language of how he typically describes Romans. He's not even really describing anything specific about Pilate. He seems to be just using stock language of what he talks about, of how he talks about Romans in general. So it doesn't really even seem like it's anything like specific, and it seems like it's exaggerated. Ironically, skeptics put up like Philo like he's infallible on his word with regards to how Pontius Pilate actually was, but you can find motives in there, and so he seems to be the one who's actually exaggerating the language, not so much Josephus or the Gospels and how they're portraying him. And the third thing is you can find a correlation in here to what we see in the Gospels. Okay, what is the thing, I believe it's in the Gospel of John, that gets Pilate to finally cave? They tell him, if you don't crucify him, you are no friend of Caesar. Okay, what happens in Philo? They threaten to tell Tiberius that you got to do what we say or we're going to tell on you. And it says that as soon as Pilate heard this, he became exceedingly worried, and he just became so stressed out by it. So again, you're finding correlations with there. And so again, if you're going to take the exaggerated language over what we see in Josephus and the Gospels, sure, Pilate was an evil guy, but again, that's a conjecture you're making based on what he would have allowed with regards to burial practices. And again, it doesn't seem like we see that in Josephus. Or the actual account of Pilate. Pilate just seems to cave to the Jews when Tiberius scolds him. He gives in to their demands that would easily set a precedent that now the Jews have leverage over him they can use for future, clashes with him and whatnot. So, I mean, I don't really see this horrible, evil second coming of Herod the Great in these accounts. This is very easily addressed.
Do you recall the dating on that first one, when he was scolded by Tiberius? When did that happen? Do you know?
In Philo, it seems to be very early on when he first kind of gets there, and that correlates with Josephus's account of him putting images on the temple. So it seems like it happened pretty early on.
And that seems to correlate with the Gospels too, because if this was Passover time and he was already on thin ice with the Romans, like it just seems so obvious that he would cave to the mobs there.
Yeah, it doesn't, and he caves to the mobs in Josephus's account in the first instance. Yeah. So I think Pilate came in as a hothead, thought he was going to change a bunch of things, learned very quickly that going against the Jews on these things is going to come up with problems and issues. And what they're also not noting is around the same time is Tiberius had just uncovered a coup by someone named Sejanus. Sejanus killed Tiberius' son, was going to take over. Tiberius figured it out, and he became exceedingly paranoid. He went after anyone connected with Sejanus. I think a lot of the governors were probably walking on eggshells considering who Tiberius was going after. It would make sense that, getting a bad report from your subjects to Tiberius could set him off pretty easily. I don't think Pilate, and I think a lot of the other governors were aware of what was going on. Just read the accounts with Tiberius dealing with the aftermath of the Sejanus coup.
Awkward silence.
I was talking a lot. It's like trying to let someone else go.
Yeah.
I wish I knew more about this.
Yeah, I honestly like history.
Oh, I'm sorry, I muted myself. I was trying to.
Oh no, it's okay.
Trying to get in there. Yeah. Okay. So in response to the thing, the other thing I was going to say with regards to Pilate was that in the Gospels we see that when Pilate is questioning Jesus, the idea that he's just this like nice person, or that he is this like that he's portrayed in the Gospels favorably, is I think sort of a myth. Like if you actually read the Gospels, Pilate is not portrayed as positively as some people might suspect him to be.
Oh yeah, he has Jesus flogged at one point. I mean,
Yeah, I think a lot of what people point out is the thing where he calls Jesus, he says he thinks Jesus is innocent or whatever, or that type of thing. And I think too that's kind of illustrative of just the realization that literally Christ has done nothing wrong. That doesn't mean that Pilate's a good guy. I mean, it's just it shows even more that even though people don't like him, that even the truth is even clear to him, where the Sanhedrin it's just not clear to them, or is clear to them, and they don't care.
I mean, they're painting him as like this one-dimensional Disney villain. I mean, they brought him, Pilate, we brought you someone to kill. Splendid. I love killing people. No, we can't be buried now because I'm evil. That's not how people are in history. Okay, like Hannibal. Hannibal crushed Rome at the Battle of Cannae. I might be pronouncing that wrong. Historians wrestle over why Hannibal didn't go and sack Rome after this. He tried to sue for peace. He thought he had, if you're reading Livy, up until that point, you'd think Hannibal was go and sack Rome because it's painted this picture that he just hated the Romans. He wanted to utterly destroy them. He utterly destroys them at the Battle of Cannae, and he just sues for peace. Now, historians don't go, well, that just was inconsistent with this one-dimensional villain we have, so clearly there must be something wrong here. No, they go, okay, well, he was a complex person. He probably thought he had vanquished them and didn't want to risk losing more men, whatever it may be. They don't try to just say, well, the accounts are wrong because he always just wanted to kill Rome. If he had a chance to kill Romans, he would have just killed Romans because he hated Romans. And any account that disagrees with that shows that, it's wrong. Or think of Alexander the Great. I mean, he puts to death Clitus the Black when he gets deeper into Asia, even though you've already established the fact that Alexander really cared for his troops and his soldiers. You've already established the fact that Clitus actually saved his life in an earlier battle. So are we just going to dismiss that he actually executed Clitus the Black because we can find inconsistency with his earlier character? No, we think Alexander the Great was a complex person and, things change over time. Why is Pilate a one-dimensional Disney villain who just always has to be evil?
So this might be a little something that I found fascinating about Pilate was how I think the Jews are because he wanted to put on Jesus's cross, he wanted to put King of the Jews, but I think people were objecting to it or something to say like they wanted him to put supposed King of the Jews, but instead he put the King of the Jews, that's what fascinating me. I know it's kind of a little off topic from what we're talking about right now, but it is kind of weird that he would do that. I don't know if anyone.
Well, it just seems to me that it's like an example of him saying, okay, well, whatever, I already did what I did. You're not going to be bothered any further by this stupid mock trial you guys are having. And the same with the burial. It's not like he's going out of his way to give the body to Joseph Arimathea. I'm sure if Joseph Arimathea says, oh, I would like this body, Pilate, or whatever, Pilate doesn't, he's going to say, yeah, whatever, take it. It's not like we're at war here, right?
Well, you're right. There's no evidence Pilate insisted on not allowing burials. Yeah, there's no evidence Pilate insisted on not allowing burials. I mean, this is a conjecture they make from reading Philo and misquoting Josephus, because Josephus adds a lot more nuance to what's going on to these things, and we barely get that.
One thing that I thought was interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead. It wasn't that important.
Okay, yeah. So one thing that I thought was interesting about the debate in general, and I saw this in your debate with Godless Engineer Michael, that kind of made me laugh, was this expectation by the skeptic that as a Christian who thinks the Bible is authoritative, that we're going to use it for evidence in our case. And because the two criticisms that Jim had for his case were there's no physical tomb that we know of, which kind of there is, and that the Bible is, his claim that the Gospels are unreliable, which, and then none of your claims came from that. All of your stuff was from outside historical context. And I think it's just, and also too, even on the claims that the Gospels are inconsistent, even if that were to be the case, all of the Gospels agree that Christ was buried in a tomb. So there's no good reason to think that, based on the evidence that Jim gave, that there's reason to doubt the historicity of the tomb, that Jesus was buried in the tomb. So
right.
Well, I mean,
and
go ahead.
Do you want to go ahead?
No, I've been talking too much. Go ahead.
Well, what also fascinated me too was how, don't even scholars look to the New Testament just to kind of confirm? I mean, that's the thing, is these skeptics can be kind of well, you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. I mean, well, you have New Testament scholars who use the New Testament to at least, help them out. I mean, I don't see it just doesn't make, to me, it just doesn't make sense, because the New Testament can serve as how it highlights that the that the Jews were expelled from Rome by what was it? It was by
It was Claudius who expelled them in 49
yeah,
AD.
yeah, Claudius, and we only have so what? It was only Acts who reports that, and what was the other source that reported that? Was it I can't.
It's
I think
so it's Suetonius and Acts.
Suetonius, right. And so, I mean, we should be thankful because had those people who Acts mentioned weren't like had they not been a part of that expulsion from Rome, then we probably only have one source for that, but we have two because those two people who Acts were talking about were expelled from Rome, and so I mean the Bible, the New Testament. Sorry, I mean to use New Testament can serve as can have some valuable historical information in there, and yet skeptics are always trying to say, well, this is just mythology and unreal.
The Bible is always guilty until proven innocent.
Right.
You would not do this with Polybius. You would not do this with like Josephus. Josephus, for some reason, is assumed to just be like fact. Like, well, Josephus says this. The Bible says this. Well, the Bible's wrong. It's just automatically assumed that Josephus is always right. But we know Josephus got things wrong. Like, I believe he got when Herod the Great got his kingship. I'm pretty sure he was off by 10 years. I think most historians think that Herod the Great got that at age 25. Josephus, I believe, says at age 15. So he's off by like 10 years or something.
Or even like Tacitus, too, for example, one of the finest Roman historians. I mean, didn't you mention that he tried to make an account of the origin of the Jews? And, we don't, I mean, it's not like we agree with that, but yet we still consider him very...
Yeah, he mentions that he mentions a bunch of competing hypotheses in his histories for how the Jews came about. And then he settles on one. To be fair, he seems like he's a little tentative about it, but he mentions like the Jews came in like during like the 23rd dynasty of Egypt. And we know that's false because the Merneptah Stele mentions Israel in the land during the 19th dynasty. So they had to be there a lot longer. I think Tacitus actually has a pretty grain of truth in there, but he obviously gets the time period wrong.
Right.
And one thing that I see too, you're talking about the unrealistic skepticism of the Bible and the books of the Bible is highlighted to me by the comment that Jim made when you were going over the Julius Caesar thing, when you were talking about, do you believe Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March or whatever? And he was like, and then his response was completely irrelevant, but he was like, well, do you believe Julius Caesar was a god? Or like that's not the point. It's like, it's as if to imply that we believe something because it's written in a book. No, we have other reasons for believing, for instance, the resurrection. We don't just believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead purely because the Bible says it. We have a whole case as to why we believe that. And
exactly. And that's always how it's always caricatured as well. Why don't you believe that, that Vespasian, cured blind because it's written down? Well, you're really trying to misrepresent this as best you can, aren't you?
We're not gullible.
Right. Yeah, I mean, but Dale Allison, for example, I mean, doesn't necessarily accept the resurrection as true, but he still accepts that Jesus was buried in the tomb. So, I mean, it's not like we have to assume that Jesus is God just to make a case that he was buried. I mean, that would make no sense at all.
Yeah. So the third argument you get from Cam and Camille in their response is they argue this literary argument that I've heard so much, that Mark is copying the Old Testament a lot. So it's probably he just made everything up just from taking pieces out of the Old Testament and putting it together, which I find is always a pretty bad argument because you could find so many, because again, you wouldn't apply that to other areas of history. It's again,
that's what Robert Price does too, and his I'll show you.
Yeah.
So in this book, he does the same exact thing.
6 pages.
Yeah. So.
Well, first of all, they argue like, at one point Camille's like, well, do you accept the fundamentalist argument for that these 300 prophecies in the Old Testament all point to Jesus? No, I don't. I don't ever use
any of like prominent apologists accept that? Like this, I don't even know what he's arguing against, because like I know that was like popular a long time ago that people to say that sort of thing. But who in the apologetics community is like making these arguments from prophecy? I mean, there are a few that make like, I think there are some decent arguments for
Jonathan
prophecy.
I don't agree with
but
him.
like yeah, his stuff is pretty decent, but like for the most part, this like classic Josh McDowell sort of case for the 300 prophecies or whatever, has just like completely died in the apologetics community. It's like it's not really a thing anymore.
I don't know what they've read, but they seem very like they did not know a lot about what's going on with conservative scholarship, because N.T. Wright writes about this, and he's arguing, Matthew is trying to paint Jesus as a second Moses. I mean, Luke is trying to paint him as another David. I mean, it's very clear that the gospel authors are using Old Testament stuff to talk about Jesus. It happens a lot. And so what I see from like the Josh McDowell fundamentalists and the skeptics who say that they're just mythically inventing things about Jesus from the Old Testament, they're just two sides of the same coin. They're both using the same arguments, and they're not really good arguments. This idea that, they just sort of constructed Jesus, the life and the death of Jesus out of the Old Testament is absurd, because we see Tacitus drawing from mythology to talk about current events. We see Virgil doing the same thing. In fact, Camille in his talk actually mentions an example that kind of shoots himself in the foot. He mentions that in late antiquity, they would go through Virgil's Aeneid and find older things and reinterpret them as oracles for their current time period. Okay, that doesn't mean they were just making things up. They were just applying a double meaning to it. My argument has always been that they went through the Old Testament and they looked for similarities. Okay, Jesus did this thing that was kind of similar to Moses. We'll just paint it in that picture. To give an analogy, I used to live in Illinois. Southern Illinois. It has a nickname. It's called Little Egypt. When I lived there, I worked for a guy who has been criticized for treating his employees like slaves. So I was a slave in Egypt. Then I left and I moved to Tucson. Well, Tucson's the desert. And before I could do my ministry full time, I worked 4 years at some odd jobs doing stuff. So I was in Little Egypt as a slave. I went into the desert for 4 years before I could finally do my ministry full time. Oh my gosh, look, everything I must have said has been a lie. Or it's very easy for me or anyone to look at current events and paint them as past. Think about how many sermons you've been where a pastor will compare something in his life to something that happened in the Bible. It just happens. People painted Abraham Lincoln like another Moses. People painted, they paint JFK in themes of Camelot. So what? That doesn't mean they made everything up. This argument that it supposedly supports their mythic interpretation, it's really a neutral argument, because you can use it for history and mythic invention. It doesn't mean it's one or the other.
Herodotus even often frames a lot of his accounts in the same language and the same vocabulary and the same narrative as Homer's work. So there's secular historical examples as well.
Yeah, Romans did that often with Homer's work. They were always painting stuff after Homer.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense that they just keep using this argument, even though it's obviously been refuted by the examples we've seen in history of other people using the same methods, and they still we'll use it anyway because we can use it on the Gospels because the Gospels are already myths, so we'll just use it on them, and it's just like, oh my. Yeah.
No, I think the basic point, their argument seems to be simply that because we see these examples where you have copying going on, apparently, even though that's not really, you can obviously make a comparison between the New Testament and the Old Testament. So I guess the argument that Robert Price brings up is that it's more likely that they just copied stories rather than the event actually occurring. Here's the probability is lower.
Back on that, though. Yeah, here's the way to push back on that, though, is that they had such two reasons. They had such a large library of stories in the Old Testament. They could draw from, let's say Peter actually went with Jesus to the cross. Okay, they're going to paint him as Moses and Aaron. Or, let's say instead of when Jesus' family fled to Egypt in Matthew, maybe they flee to Assyria. Okay, well, they could paint it as the return of the northern kingdom of Israel. If they flee to Arabia, they could talk about maybe it was Moses' or the Egyptians' wandering time and they finally come into the promised land. There's such a large repertoire they could pull from. And the second thing is they cherry-picked a lot of these prophecies. So take Psalm 69, where they get the prophecy of him being given the sour wine on the cross. Well, if you read Psalm 69, it also says he was given poison for food. But there's nothing in the New Testament about Jesus being given poison for food at his death. Or at his resurrection, the book of Daniel talks about the resurrected body shining like a star. Well, they never described Jesus as shining like a star. So they picked stuff. They said, okay, well, this matches, let's go with it. All right, this matches, it goes like it. It's just as likely that they just looked at things and go, oh, look, this we can compare this to something that happened in the past. It's no different than people talking about JFK in terms of Camelot, or people talking about Abraham Lincoln like it's Moses, or any pastor when he says, like, when I was in college, I felt like I was Daniel in the lion. Daniel in the lion's den. People do that, but it's only a problem when it comes to the Bible. Again, skeptics apply a double standard. These prove mythic inventions when it comes to the Bible, but when other people do it, no, it doesn't.
Right, and you made a good point in your recent video. Had Judas, and had Judas, or I think it was the most recent video. Had Judas, turned back to Jesus, I mean, they probably would have painted him as another Jonah. I mean, you made a good point there, and so but yeah, I agree that they're painting Jesus like another Moses figure, or somewhere along the lines of that.
Right. They're scripturalizing history. They're not historicizing prophecy. Like, if they were historicizing prophecy, we would expect it to be much more of like a similar account. And what we see is just that the fact that they telling the stories based on Old Testament stories that they remember, not that they're inventing history.
Right.
Like when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that this happened according to the scriptures, he's saying that not that the scriptures are the reason he knows this. It's just that he's rereading scripture in light of what happened in history, not the other way around.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Tacitus did that. Virgil did that. What do you want?
Yeah, I feel like one big problem with the mythical invention paralleling prophecy, whatnot, is actually related to something that Jim brought up, where he was mentioning the idea that he thought that the Gospels were used for apologetic purposes. And the thing is, when you really start to think about that, that's extremely problematic, especially based on when they date the Gospels. Because Jim was painting it in this way of, oh, they did it so that they could answer all these questions about, oh, where did Jesus go? Is he coming back? And all that. And I think, there's the 7 letters of Paul that even skeptical scholars are like, those are Paul. They're dated to the 50s or the 60s or whenever. And look at all the issues that the church is struggling with there. Like, for one thing, none of those issues are addressed in the Gospels. For another thing, like, if you were to have a mythic invention for the purposes of like exactly fulfilling prophecy or something like that, you would expect it to be a lot closer, and you just don't find that. So
right, that's a good point. I mean, the Gospels are not really helping the early church, compared to the issue at Acts 15, for example. I mean, we don't have Jesus talking about circumcision at all. When they were just inventing things up, they could have said, well, Jesus said this, therefore. There's very little evidence of them ever doing anything like that.
With regards to apologetic devices, it seems to me that if anything is an apologetic device, it would be something like the guard at the tomb. And while I don't think it is, that one can at least make an argument that that's sort of an apologetic addition. But the tomb itself, I just don't see how a good apologetic argument for anything.
Well, that's a good point, because this is something I brought up in the debate. Is like, why invent the tomb? They didn't need to invent a tomb. They could have had Jesus thrown into like a common grave, and that would have been perfect with prophecy. If you read Isaiah 53:9, it just says he made his grave with the wicked, and there was rich present, depending on how you interpret it. Okay, the Sanhedrin, according to mission law, had to have graves for these people. That would have fit with the prophecy. The prophecies are very vague. They don't know. Nothing in Isaiah says he had to be buried in a rich man's tomb. These are extremely vague prophecies. That's why I don't put a lot of emphasis on them. But fundamentalists and the mythicists do. They say, oh, they're constructing this, and the fundamentalists say, oh, see, this just proves the Jesus account. But it's like, you're both just reading way too much into these prophecies. They're vague for a reason. I mean, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says why.
Right. And if and it sort of cuts against them, because if they want to argue that the story in the Gospel was initially improbable and this doesn't make any sense why Joseph would do this, and doesn't make any sense why Pilate would allow this, why would they be arguing something so implausible? Why would they be telling such an implausible story instead of, if they didn't know where the tomb was, why wouldn't they make something up that seems to be more in line with what we would expect if we didn't have the gospel testimony? Why wouldn't they have it so that Jesus was just buried in just a which would be the most the most initially plausible thing that would happen to Jesus' body after he was crucified, why would they invent this story of a Sanhedrin member, which could be verified, and you had skeptic Christianity, like that sort of thing is sort of common knowledge, right? Like the idea that would just disappear from history and no one would ever heard of him. If you were just making something up like that, and said that Jesus was buried in that guy's tomb, like a famous person's tomb, it just seems to me that the Gospels wouldn't invent something like that.
Yeah, I like what Dale Allison says on this. He says, "Are we to believe that the Christians who acknowledge the humiliation of crucifixion were somehow unable to allow that Jesus was denied a decent burial, as though the latter was more dreadful than the former?" I mean, his basic point is that Christians embrace the fact that Jesus was shamefully crucified. If he was shamefully buried,
Yeah,
they're just going to embrace that too. And in fact, they could have used it. I brought this up in the debate, but they could have used it. Like if they're just inventing myth. Matthew says, when Jesus died, all the tombs were open. Well, if Jesus was thrown into a mass grave, when Jesus was resurrected, he brought everyone back to life with him. Oh, look at how powerful he is. And now you have all these extra witnesses you could claim were available.
Yeah. And I think, too, this whole debate articulates or shows this unwillingness of the skeptic to give any ground at all on the cumulative case, even on claims that are not extraordinary. Like, this is an extraordinarily simple claim with no reason to be made up at all that I can reasonably think of. And so you're just like battling over something that's nonsensical. One of the notes I wrote down was that there's really nothing for you two to be debating over. Like the evidence is all towards the side that he was buried in a tomb. Now we can't know that with Cartesian certainty because it's history. But probabilistically speaking, like it just makes more sense. And so,
yeah, there's always a special standard of how we judge the Bible versus other ancient documents. Like for example, I'm going to do a video in the winter on camels because the Bible mentions Abraham owned camels, and we know there weren't any camels in the Levant before till about the Iron Age. But they fail to mention that Abraham came from Ur, where we know there were camels going back to like the 4th millennium or the 3rd millennium. So it's like, again, it's always, the Bible's always guilty until proven innocent. If it was any other document, we would be like, oh, we have more attestation for these certain things here or there.
Right, and even if Jim wanted to try to,
and it shows when they look at the variation of the Bible.
I was gonna say that, like, I mean, Jim has like a really big hill to climb, or an uphill battle, if he wanted to try to refute the idea that Jesus was buried in a tomb. I mean, it's as ridiculous as it looks. I mean, hey, if he wants to go for it, then he can, but he's got a long hill to climb for sure.
Jim sort of struggles to give this example of a variation in the Gospels too, surrounding the empty tomb, not even the burial of Jesus. So I don't really know why it got brought up, but one of his big points was this variation, and he doesn't treat it at all like you would treat other sort of accounts, because the idea that these accounts are just impossible to harmonize, or are even difficult to harmonize in some of these cases, including the one he brought up, is like these are so easily harmonizable that any sort of critical thinking, I think, applied to these texts, not immediately jumping to contradiction, lead to a very sensible account in which both of them are telling the same thing in different ways.
I see it as had all the accounts looked exactly the same, or almost exactly the same, then I think we'd have reason for doubt, because they just won't be copying from each other. But the fact that we do have variations actually testifies that they're Greco-Roman biographies, because, I mean, look at J. Warner Wallace, for example. He's interviewed tons of eyewitnesses who always contradict. Like, you separate the eyewitnesses, they're going to tell you different things. Like, you have a car wreck, for example, they're going to give you different details, and it's going to, you're going to be like, okay, what's going on here? Like, you guys all saw the same thing. Why are you disagreeing about these things? I mean, that's just the nature of eyewitness testimony. I mean, we even see that in ancient history too. I know IP brought up plenty of examples in his New Testament series, but I mean, this is just common for eyewitnesses to disagree. So, I mean, but of course, since it's the Gospels, we're going to ignore.
And even if they were copying Mark, I mean, the attestation says that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. If I'm Matthew, why would I not rely on an account of someone who was very close to Jesus that I knew? So, I mean, like, there's no reason for them not to use Mark. If I was going to write a biography of my father and my mom already wrote a shorter one, I'm probably going to use that one because my mom is closer to my dad than I am. Why wouldn't I?
If you're writing something, then why wouldn't you look at previous examples of the people writing similar things? Like if you're writing any sort of book, you're gonna read the other books in that field, right? Like if you're gonna like write a romance novel, you're gonna read other romance novels before trying yourself.
Yeah,
Like-
it's, again, when it comes to the Gospels, it's a problem. But for any other ancient work, it wouldn't be.
Right.
Yeah, this is, as I said in the beginning, this is why I did the debate, because it was a perfect example to show the special pleading that's going on that you wouldn't get with any other ancient work. That's why I went through Livy and Polybius and noted the differences. I've actually been thinking maybe I should do a video where I just take one of Bart Ehrman's like opening statements of his debates and just do it, but with Polybius and Polybius. Just take everything he said, just replace it and go like, okay, well, did Hannibal come to the Isacarus River in Rome, or did he come to the Sara in Rome? Did the Allobroges betray him or not? Did he push all the snow away or not? Did he go into this town? It's so easy to do that. But that's how silly it would sound if you went into a Roman historian like academic lecture and did that thing. People would look at you like you're crazy. They'd be like, "Come on, man, this is easy to harmonize." But when it comes to the New Testament, well, that's perfect. It makes perfect sense.
If you ever did that, please send that to Bart.
Yeah.
I want to see his reaction. I really do.
Yes.
I'm really thinking about it. I want to go through and really like read them like thoroughly, and I would just focus on like him crossing the Alps because that's very extraordinary. It happened once. It's close to a miracle. How do you get elephants across the Alps with ancient technology? I won't even want to attempt it with modern technology, but he managed to do it, and so it's that's why I like comparing him to Hannibal because it's almost a miracle.
Right.
So
And
I do need to get
the
off-
sort of contradiction argument against
No, go ahead.
the contradiction argument against the Gospels sort of presupposes that the Gospels are unreliable, because if we already think that these documents are reliable, why wouldn't I mean, some of it may be able to be attributed to like genre, but for the most part, why wouldn't you try and fit two reliable accounts together? Like they do this all the time. Like if you think two people are reliable, you're not just going to say if they tell two stories differently, oh well, contradictory. We go and look at like how they could fit together. That's like basic work that you do to reconcile accounts.
Right. And we even see people trying to harmonize the resurrection accounts because that's where variation can get high, but I mean we can still do it. And so I mean it may not be as accurate as the event went, but I mean we can get pretty close to it.
Is there anything else we wanted to address with Cam and Cam? I know they made a mistake, but I pointed out to them on Facebook. They thought John said that Joseph of Arimathea was afraid of Pilate, when really it says he was afraid of the Jews for requesting.
Well, actually, I think the last point. Sorry. Okay, so the last point would be he actually, if you go down to the comments on the video, Camille actually puts a timestamp on to summarize the whole thing, and basically what he basically said was it's just a story, right? So it's just a story that they just added on that there was a burial. So I mean, what's your response to that kind of argument?
I mean, Hannibal's just a story. No one crosses the Alps with elephants. I mean, no one defeats 300 Japanese ships with just 12. That's just a story, guys. I mean, that's
Right.
again special standard. They would never apply it to any other ancient work or any other account. I mean, some nomad from north of China somehow forms the largest empire, defeats sacks all these cities. Come on, that's just a story, guys. You really think, Genghis Khan really did all that? It's just a story. I mean, think if I could keep listing examples. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, both died on July 4th, the same day, on the 50th anniversary of American independence. Oh, that's just a story. Clearly, coincidences like that don't happen.
Or take the example.
And he didn't mention the Great
Yeah.
Wall, so therefore,
take
problem.
the 300 army. I mean, 300 soldiers can't take out all those troops. Surely not.
Oh, the Peloponnesian War. Yeah, they blocked him for several days. I mean, how does Athens prevail at sea against a giant fleet of the empire, the Persian Empire? I mean, this tiny little city states that were always fighting each other somehow managed to beat the world's largest empire at that time. That's improbable.
Or like, okay, take all the coincidences between Kennedy and Lincoln. Okay, with all those coincidences, yeah, Kennedy was just made up from Lincoln. I mean, nobody would conclude that. I mean, we know Kennedy.
And to build on that, isn't JFK always painted in Camelot themes? Oh, now he definitely is a myth.
Right.
Yeah, it's double standard.
Yeah. So one more thing we had discussed that we wanted to bring up was a comment on the debate, the original debate, that had an interesting objection. It's talking about how empty tombs, and it's one of these typical mythicist things, like the Horus thing, where they parallel it. But it was interesting because it was a little different, because it was talking about how empty tombs and miraculous missing body stories were a big literary theme, and it drew this parallel to this Greek novel, Caliro. I can't speak Greek, but But anyhow, Tim, you did some research on that, so want to talk about that? Or
Dylan, I wasn't able to read the whole novel, but Dylan had a thing.
Yeah,
too.
well, I actually read a Wikipedia article on it. It was nothing like what the Gospels had reported. So basically, the person who I can't remember the name of the person. Sorry about that, but the person who supposedly came back to life was in a coma. He was in a coma. Okay, so he didn't die. Okay, what happened were this group of people came, and this guy awoke from the coma and scared them all. Yeah, totally like the gospel narratives. Totally like them.
Was there even a tomb? Was there a tomb? Was there an empty tomb? Because that's what he was. Because that's what alleged, that there was some sort of empty tomb in this.
Basically,
narrative.
Now, I can't tell you that this is entirely accurate, because I wanted to get just a summary of what happened. And what I saw was that, okay, so the tomb was not empty. What happened, or this group of people came to the tomb, the person was already, in the tomb. The person who they thought was dead was in the tomb and awoke from a coma and scared them all. It's just nothing like the gospel stories. And now, if you guys want to do further research on this, just to confirm that this, because it is from a Wikipedia article, so I can't say for sure that this is what happened, that it happened this way. But either way, I mean, this is nothing like the gospel accounts. Nothing like it whatsoever. And yet, so what they're doing, here's what I suspect. All these supposed stories that you see, some came after the empty tomb story, so if anybody was copying, it was obviously them. But even the ones that came before them, this is exactly what Jesus mythicists do when it comes to the existence of Jesus. They'll take these cherry-picked examples of all these figures from history who obviously weren't anywhere near like Jesus. If anything, you have superficial similarities. But this story that I was just citing has superficial similarities to the empty tomb story. But it's always going to have these fundamental differences that, of course, they're not going to cite because they're trying to make their case. And so they're going to quote all these similarities like they're a big deal and leave out the big differences. And it does not make sense to me. Every time, if you want to confirm that these guys are telling the truth, buy some history books on these figures or these stories that they're telling, and they always turn out to be nothing like the Gospels. It's just...
Yeah, they do the same thing with Asclepius. They say, Asclepius had the same miracles as Jesus, but they don't tell you it's Asclepius. The miracles attributed to Asclepius post-date his death, it was at his temple kind of thing. People go there, and there's so many differences. They just pick 2 or 3 out that match Jesus out of these several dozen or so. They're nothing like the gospel. But yeah, that's what I see mysticists doing all that all the time, and yeah, I got to track down all these original sources and to show that it's just utter nonsense.
Yeah. One thing.
Tim,
sorry, you're good.
Well, I wanted to ask Tim if he had actually looked more into that article, because
I do need to take off soon though. If there's anything else.
The novel. Okay.
Yeah, that novel I was trying because I was.
Yeah, those other. I mean, I didn't read the novel, and I'm probably not going to read the novel. Like, I'm not going to read the, because first of all, it's a work of fiction. I feel that this thing that he was referencing wasn't even a real story. So this idea that like the Gospels were copying from other fictional narratives about some guy who was in a coma, like I don't feel like it's worth going deeper than that. Like, if I always figure that if no other sort of skeptical scholar has like brought this up, like the odds that they've discovered like this perfect parallel to the Gospels is much lower than they think it is.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately for the viewers, we won't have time to get to questions. So if you have any questions, you can ask IP directly on Facebook or email him or whatever. So we do. I know, Michael, you said you have to get going. Is there anything else? Any additional thoughts you guys want to discuss? Or
No, I think
I'd refer people.
Sorry, what?
Nope, I'm not talking.
I'll just say this real quick. I found it funny that Camille was trying to trigger me in their response by doing what he called cheap jabs, because I sort of laughed at that because I'm like, I guess it must be he's trying to get revenge, because based on his first comment on that video, I must have triggered him somehow.
Yeah.
But if you're going to call your arguments cheap jabs, you're basically admitting.
I guess I'd just refer people.
All right. Well, I guess.
TJ?
Do you have anything else?
One more thing. Yeah, I was just going to say that I would refer to like people to some of the evidence for the site at the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, because Jim kept attacking that, and like I just think that his criticisms of that thesis was really, really weak. Like I think that including like Jim Charlesworth thinks that that's the tomb of Jesus, and he's one of the experts on like archaeology in the first century Judea. So there's a lot of stuff with regards to that tomb at the Holy Sepulchre, and it's not like a hill to die on, but I certainly think the evidence is better than Jim would go to, and I would refer people to like the National Geographic article that they did on the tomb of Jesus in 2017 when a lot of the new evidence was brought up. That's all.
Yeah, and that made me laugh too, because he was like, "Oh, all the evidence from contemporary scholarship points against the Holy Sepulchre," and I'm like, it's completely not true. Like that's the opposite of true. Like we have more reasons to believe that it is the tomb of Jesus now. So.
All right. Well, I guess we've gone pretty well. So we talked about the debate, and then we kind of addressed the objections, and I think everyone had their good thoughts. And so yeah, thanks Michael for coming on, and as well as thanks for the others. We're working on a big project right now. I'm not gonna tell anything yet, but in October I'm gonna do a short little video, and I'll kind of go over the introduction for the big project that me, Dylan, TJ, the other Kyle, and like 15 other people are working on. So that should be pretty well. And then, so Michael, I have just one question. Are you ever interested in debating Pelagia on the resurrection, or you don't know yet?
Apologia?
Yeah.
I would prefer to debate him on a topic like on miracles, because you keep hearing this claim. He said before that miracles are always the least probable. And my big thing about the resurrection is that I don't like to debate atheists on it, because we're not even on the same page. So I'd like to debate him on like the same thing I was going to debate Matt Dillahunty on that I didn't get to. Like, is the resurrection justifiable? I want to talk about miracles. I want to talk about prior probability, that kind of stuff. Just that in general, because I feel like that'd be a much better debate, because we could try to get more on the same page. Because I don't think Christians and atheists are on the same page when they debate that, and I would like to try to address that more.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to end the stream now, but thank you guys for watching, and check out IP stuff. So yeah. And anyways, as far as this channel goes, I'm going to be working on a new series that'll be coming out it'll start next week. So So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Michael, again for coming on, and that'll be it.
All right.